Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. With the Stanley Cup lifted and the playoffs concluded, the 22-23 NHL season has officially come to an end, and while another chapter has closed in the league's history books, all eyes have immediately shifted to the 2023 off-season. Now, while the season shall be remembered for its historic ending, this finale might not be the biggest story of the year. In fact, thanks to a particular contest towards the end of the season and the string of events that would quickly follow, a seemingly routine game in mid-April has changed the course of the league for many years to come. But how has this happened? How has a single regular season game done so much damage, and why has it created such a chain reaction too? Well, let's take a look at it in a little more detail and try to figure it out, shall we? So in today's video, join me as we explore the game that changed the National Hockey League. Now, in order to understand this whole situation, allow me to take you back to April 11th, 2023, when the Chicago Blackhawks visited the PPG Paints Arena to take on the Pittsburgh Penguins in either team's penultimate game of the 22-23 season. With the Blackhawks sitting bottom 5 in the NHL standings, and with Pittsburgh just 2 points out of tying the Florida Panthers for the second wildcard in the East, the hometown Penguins really needed to win this game if they wanted to keep their playoff hopes alive. Though the game would be tied 1-1 midway through the final period of play, a pair of Chicago goals, courtesy of Buddy Robinson and Andreas Athanasiou, just 26 seconds apart, would give the visiting side a 2-goal lead with less than 10 minutes to play in regulation time. And though Pittsburgh's Danton Heinen would pull the Penguins within 1 during the final minute of the game, the Blackhawks would respond just 15 seconds later, they would win the game 5-2, and they would leave the arena with the 2 points. So in a span of 26 seconds, Pittsburgh had seen a close tie game with everything to play for quickly turn into an eventual rout and a failure to gain ground in a tight wildcard race. Their entire season was ended in just 26 seconds. In fact, these 26 seconds would have quite the ripple effect on the league, as the events of this game would impact several different NHL franchises, most of whom had nothing to do with the contest itself. By losing their game against the Blackhawks, the Pittsburgh Penguins were no longer able to catch the Florida Panthers for the second wildcard spot in the East, so Florida clinched a postseason berth, while the Penguins were officially eliminated from playoff contention. Speaking of the Panthers, having secured the final playoff berth in the East, and having entered the postseason as the lowest ranked team in the competition, the underdog Panthers would surpass all expectations. Thanks to their incredible comeback against the President's Trophy winning Boston Bruins, their 5-game series against the Toronto Maple Leafs, and their 4-game sweep of the Carolina Hurricanes, the Panthers somehow defied the odds and made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time since 1996, before eventually falling to the Vegas Golden Knights in 5 games. Ooh, so close yet so far, right? As the Panthers clinched the playoffs and embarked on their deep postseason run, the Penguins were busy making changes off the ice instead. Having lost to the Blackhawks 5-2, and having suffered an overtime loss to the Columbus Blue Jackets only a few days later, Pittsburgh's ownership decided that they needed to change who was in charge. For failing to lead the team back to the playoffs, and with rumours of brewing frustrations from several star players within the organisation, Pittsburgh's President of Hockey Operations Brian Burke and General Manager Ron Hextall were both relieved of their duties shortly after the season concluded. So thanks to a routine game in mid-April between Pittsburgh and Chicago, the Florida Panthers had made it to the postseason and would end up going all the way to the finals, while Pittsburgh had missed the playoffs altogether and had fired 2 key members of their front office instead. Imagine how different things could have turned out had these roles been reversed. Perhaps Pittsburgh would have made it to the finals and Florida would have undergone a shake-up instead. While these 2 outcomes certainly weren't guaranteed, it's interesting to think what might have been, you know? While we're still on the subject of Florida, by making it all the way to the finals, the Panthers had ended the seasons of several different teams along the way, including a Boston Bruins side that had set a new NHL record for the most wins during a single regular season. However, perhaps the most notable of these opponents was the Toronto Maple Leafs, who by defeating the Tampa Bay Lightning in 6 games, had reached the second round of the playoffs for the first time since 2004, before eventually falling at the hands of the Panthers in Game 5 of their second round series. Now, shortly after their second round exit, Leafs general manager Kyle Dubas would depart from the organisation as his contract with the franchise had come to an end. Though he had built a team that had won its first playoff series in nearly 2 decades, and though he had been expected to re-sign with the Leafs nearly all season long, Dubas's comments to the media during the team's exit day suggested that he was unsure if he wanted to come back. These comments seemingly rubbed Toronto's management the wrong way, as Leafs Director of Hockey Operations Brendan Shanahan later revealed that up until the night before that exit interview, the two sides were still working on an extension to keep Dubas in Toronto. But following Dubas's comments to the media that day, Shanahan decided to make a change. According to Shanahan himself, Dubas had supposedly contacted him the night before saying that he still wanted to stay on as GM of the team, but after Dubas's agent requested a further increase to his client's salary, and after Dubas's questionable comments to the media that day, Shanahan decided to cut ties with Dubas and begin the search for a new GM instead, who would eventually end up being Brad Treliving of the Calgary Flames. Now, as you can imagine, Dubas's departure from the Leafs and the rather scandalous way in which it all went down sparked its fair share of controversy amongst fans and the media alike. But what would have happened had things turned out differently? What if Toronto had beaten the Panthers and made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals? Better yet, what if they faced Pittsburgh in round 2 instead? Would Kyle Dubas still be with the Leafs? Would they have been willing to give him that pay rise that he wanted? Or would he still have left once his contract had expired? Interesting stuff to think about, right guys? Having cleaned house in their team's front office, the Pittsburgh Penguins were on the hunt for the next leader of their management group. Well, after several weeks of searching, and after initial rumours turned to concrete reports, the Penguins had found their man, as on June 1st, 2023, Pittsburgh announced that they had hired a new president of hockey operations. And who was hired for the job? Well, none other than former Leafs GM Kyle Dubas. So thanks to his controversial exit from Toronto, and thanks to a brand new opening in Pittsburgh, Kyle Dubas had left Canada behind and was taking his talents to Pennsylvania. Now, in Dubas's defense, he did say that he wouldn't GM another team in the league during his exit interview, but I doubt that a higher role with a different organisation was how most people interpreted that statement, you know? Now, while Pittsburgh's playoff exit and Dubas's departure from Toronto aren't mutually exclusive, as Dubas could have still left the Leafs and moved elsewhere in the league, would he have gone to Pittsburgh had the Penguins beaten Chicago and made it to the playoffs over Florida? After all, would the Penguins have fired Burke and Hextall? Would the Leafs have been eliminated in the second round of the postseason? And would Dubas have still left Toronto to take the resulting opening in Pittsburgh? Of course, this is purely hypothetical, as we'll never know for sure, but I highly doubt that this situation arises and all of these decisions are made had Pittsburgh made it to the playoffs and things turned out slightly differently. So we've talked a lot about the Penguins and how this loss affected both their own organisation as well as several other playoff teams around them, but what about the Chicago Blackhawks? How did this game affect them in the several months that followed? Well, as it turns out, this victory would bring the franchise far more success than their Pennsylvanian opponents. By defeating the Penguins 5-2 and by leaving Pittsburgh with the 2 points, Chicago would secure just their 26th win that season, and following their overtime loss to the Philadelphia Flyers on April 13th, the Blackhawks would close out the year having finished 30th place in the regular season standings with a rather abysmal 26, 49 and 7 record for 59 points in 82 games. However, by finishing so low in the standings, the rebuilding Blackhawks had given themselves an 11.5% chance of securing the first overall pick in the upcoming draft lottery and the third highest opportunity to select the league's next up-and-coming phenom, Connor Bedard. Though Chicago last picked first overall back in 2007, and though both the Anaheim Ducks and the Columbus Blue Jackets each had a higher chance of securing the top pick, fortune would fall Chicago's way. Once the lottery had concluded on May 8, 2023, it was revealed that the Chicago Blackhawks had secured the first overall pick in the 2023 NHL entry draft. So thanks to their unlikely win against the Penguins, and thanks to their overtime loss against the Flyers, the Chicago Blackhawks had finished third worst in the league standings, had won the 2023 draft lottery, and were the last team standing during the Connor Bedard sweepstakes. Given that their win against the Penguins helped them finish in 30th place, and given that this position ended up securing the first overall draft pick, Chicago's win against Pittsburgh played a pretty huge part in securing a generational talent and their franchise's next superstar. Remember folks, this all happened because of 2 goals in 26 seconds. Now, while Chicago celebrated their draft lottery win, the other 15 teams involved would be left bitterly disappointed. None more so than the Columbus Blue Jackets. After all, Columbus held the same amount of points as Chicago by the end of the year, and they had a higher chance of winning the draft lottery, but thanks to them winning less games than the Blackhawks that year, Chicago won the tiebreaker and sat in 30th place in the league, while Columbus finished in 31st instead. However, if Pittsburgh had beaten Chicago, or if the Blackhawks had lost to Philly in regulation just a few days later, Columbus would have finished 30th overall, they would have secured the first pick over Chicago, and they would have won the Connor Bedard sweepstakes instead. Although they did end up drafting Adam Fantilli 3rd overall this year, which is a pretty solid consolation prize if you ask me. So by losing to Chicago on April 11th, the Pittsburgh Penguins had helped the Blackhawks secure Connor Bedard, while also ensuring that the Columbus Blue Jackets narrowly missed out on a generational talent. God, what a difference 26 seconds can make, eh, folks? Now, before we wrap things up, there are several other NHL teams that were affected by the domino effect that this game caused on the league, but since their links to the contest itself are minimal at best, let's explore each of them briefly before we call it quits. Thanks to their first round loss to the Florida Panthers, despite leading the series 3-1, the Boston Bruins, who had won the 2023 President's Trophy and had set a new league record for the most wins during the regular season, would bow out of the postseason far earlier than expected in what could turn out to be the Bruins' last dance with their current core of players, as veteran forward David Krejci and team captain Patrice Bergeron are rumoured to be calling it a day on their respective careers. If Pittsburgh had reached the playoffs and taken on the Bruins instead, would Boston still have suffered this first round collapse? Perhaps they would have gone on a deep postseason run, or even won the whole thing. I guess we'll never know. Speaking of Florida's postseason victims, the Panthers' sweep of the Hurricanes during the Eastern Conference Finals meant that Carolina would fall in the penultimate round for the second time in the last 5 seasons, and they would be unable to make their first finals appearance since 2006, the year they took home their first and only championship in Hurricanes franchise history. Had Pittsburgh clinched a playoff berth instead, would they have faced the Hurricanes in the conference finals, or would Carolina have faced a completely different opponent instead? Would the Hurricanes have made it to the finals, or would they fall in the penultimate round once more? Of course, there's far more variables involved in this scenario, and all of this is purely hypothetical, but it's interesting food for thought, right guys? Penultimately, thanks to their unlikely run to the finals, the Panthers would face the Vegas Golden Knights during the 2023 Stanley Cup Finals, and after a dominant performance from the Western Conference side, Vegas would secure their first championship in franchise history just 6 years after joining the league. Now, if Pittsburgh had made it instead of Florida, would Vegas have still won the Stanley Cup? Would they have faced the Penguins in the final round, or would they have seen a completely different opponent instead? Once again, none of this was guaranteed, but it's still fun to think about. And lastly, thanks to Florida's run to the Stanley Cup Finals, their first round draft pick would quickly drop from a mid-rounder to one of the latest picks of the first round. However, thanks to a trade at the 2022 deadline which sent defenseman Ben Sherratt to Florida, the Panthers' first round selection was shipped off to the Montreal Canadiens instead, before being dealt several more times before the 2023 entry draft over the last couple of days. Now, if Pittsburgh had beaten Chicago and Florida had missed the playoffs, their first round selection would have been somewhere in the top 15, and Montreal would have had 2 picks in the draft lottery before shipping off that pick a few days ago. Sure, the chances of them winning the draft lottery were minimal at best, and they still secured the 5th overall pick in this year's draft, but given that Pittsburgh chose 14th overall due to their narrow playoff miss, Montreal could have snagged themselves another mid-first round talent in a draft that's widely considered to be full of solid first rounders. God, those 26 seconds really did shake things up, didn't they? So thanks to a routine game between the Penguins and the Blackhawks, and thanks to the ripple it caused across the league, there's an argument to be made that this late season contest affected 8 different NHL teams in some shape or form. A pair of goals and 26 seconds during a game in mid-April was enough to spark several personnel changes off the ice and dramatically alter the futures of several teams on the ice too. That's quite the impact for a meaningless game between 2 mediocre teams, isn't it? Whether they were directly affected or they felt its impact later down the chain, the Blackhawks-Penguins game of April 11th, 2023 has left its mark and then some. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at the game that changed the National Hockey League. What do you guys think about this April 11th contest, or the knock-on effect it has produced on the rest of the league? Do let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Forsid, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.